For 6 years, federal detective Vincent Marlo hunted one man, Bumpy Johnson, the untouchable king of Harlem. He built a 400-page case, planted informants, and closed in with everything the federal government had. They found him 3 months later alone in a cold car, hair turned white overnight, whispering to no one. What exactly did Bumpy Johnson do to him, without ever touching him, to understand how it all led here? We go back to where it truly began. On the morning of March 14th, 1961, a patrol officer named Dennis Coyle was making his routine sweep of the parking structure on West 26th Street in Manhattan when he noticed something wrong. A black Ford sedan had been sitting in the same spot since the previous evening. Engine cold. Windows fogged from the inside. Coyle approached the vehicle the way experienced officers approach anything that feels wrong, slowly. One hand near his hip, eyes moving before his feet did. He tapped the glass with 2 knuckles. Nothing. He tapped again. Harder. The figure inside did not flinch, did not turn, did not react in any way that suggested the ordinary startled response of a man jolted from sleep. Coyle pulled the door open. Vincent Marlo was sitting perfectly upright in the driver's seat, both hands resting flat on his thighs, eyes open and fixed on the middle distance with the focused vacancy of a man watching something that was not there. He was dressed in a suit that had clearly been slept in, though the word slept implied a rest that his face did not suggest he had received. What stopped Coyle cold, what made him take a full step backward before he could compose himself, was not Marlo's stillness, and not the empty look in his eyes. It was his hair. Vincent Marlo was 34 years old. Every colleague who knew him, every photograph in his personnel file, every memory, anyone in the Federal Bureau of Investigation's New York field office carried of the man showed the same thing: thick, dark hair. The kind of black that looks almost deliberately polished. The hair of a young man who had never once considered that age might change him. The hair of the man sitting in that Ford sedan on the morning of March 14, 1961 was white. Not gray, not silver. White. Completely and uniformly, from root to end, as though every pigment cell in his scalp had simultaneously and permanently surrendered sometime between the previous evening and this particular cold morning. Coyle stood in the opening of the car door for what felt like a long time before he found his voice, when he finally asked Marlo if he was all right. Marlo did not look at him. He did not change his expression, did not alter the direction of his gaze, did not give any indication that he had heard the question at all. His lips moved instead. Barely. The faintest tremor of muscle-producing sound so quiet that Coyle had to lean into the car to hear it. He knew, Marlo was saying. He knew everything from the beginning. He repeated it 4 times before Coyle finally reached in and touched his shoulder. Even then, Marlo did not truly return. He turned his head with the mechanical slowness of a man operating at significant delay from the outside world. And when his eyes finally found Coyle's face, what Coyle saw in them was not fear, exactly, and not madness, exactly, but something that lived in the territory between the two. The particular expression of a man who has just understood something so completely and so finely that the understanding itself has become a kind of damage. The medical examiner who examined Marlo later that morning found no physical injuries, no signs of assault, no evidence of any substance beyond a trace of coffee in his system. His heart rate was elevated, but not alarmingly so. His blood pressure was high. He was physically unharmed in every measurable way, which made what had happened to him somehow more disturbing than any wound could have been. The file that federal investigators opened on the incident that afternoon was thin and unsatisfying, containing mostly questions without answers, and it would remain that way. but to understand what reduced Vincent Marlo, the sharpest investigative mind in the New York field office, a man who had never lost a case, a man who had spent 6 years building what he believed was an impenetrable wall around one of the most dangerous criminal figures in American history, to that hollow, white-haired figure in a cold car on West 26th Street. You have to go back. You have to go back to 1955 to a conference room on the 4th floor of the Federal Building in Lower Manhattan, to the afternoon that Vincent Marlo decided to hunt Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and burned coffee, which was to say it smelled like every room in that building at every hour of every workday. And Marlo had long since stopped noticing. What he noticed instead was the particular quality of silence that fell over the room when his supervisor, a thick-necked career bureaucrat named Gerald Harmon, slid a manila folder across the conference table toward him and said nothing. In federal law enforcement, the thickness of a folder communicates its own information. A thin folder means a simple case. A thick folder means complications. The folder Harmon slid toward Marlo was so thick that the brass clasp, straining to hold it shut, had been supplemented with a rubber band, and the rubber band was doing most of the work. Ellsworth Johnson, Harmon said, when Marlo opened the cover. Goes by Bumpy. Currently serving 15 years at Alcatraz for federal narcotics conspiracy. Has been incarcerated since 1953. Has controlled the numbers operation in Harlem for the better part of 20 years. Has maintained active relationships with the Genovese crime family, and this is the part I want you to pay attention to. Marlo continues to run significant portions of his criminal operation from inside a maximum security federal penitentiary on an island in San Francisco Bay. Marlo looked at the photograph clipped to the inside of the folder. A man in his late 40s, face composed and unhurried, eyes that gave nothing away. The photograph had the flat, institutional quality of a prison intake image, but even in that context, there was something in the subject's bearing that communicated a specific kind of authority, not the aggressive, though posturing authority of men who needed others to know they were dangerous, but the quiet, settled authority of a man who had already calculated every person in the room and found the calculation uninteresting. He's been locked up for 2 years, Marlo said. How is he still running anything? That, Harmon replied, is precisely what nobody has been able to figure out, and it's why nobody in this office wants this case. He paused, and the pause had the weight of a warning being carefully assembled. The last 2 agents who took serious runs at building a post-release case against Johnson. Serious runs. Marlo. Not half measures, one of them transferred to field work in rural Montana and has requested no further contact with the New York office, and the other one retired early, at 39, and last I heard, was selling insurance in New Jersey and doing quite well. Neither of them has ever publicly explained why they stepped away. Marlo looked up from the folder. Are you telling me not to take this? I'm telling you, Harmon said carefully, that Johnson is currently incarcerated and therefore not an active priority. I'm telling you the file exists and has been sitting untouched for 8 months, and I'm telling you that whatever you decide, you should decide it with full awareness that some men are difficult to approach, not because they are violent, but because they are intelligent. Johnson has never, not once in his criminal career, been caught doing anything himself. Everything that could be directly attributed to him has always turned out, upon examination, to have been done by someone else, and that someone else has always, reliably, been the person that investigators were looking at right before they stopped looking. With respect, Marlo said, and closed the folder with a quiet, deliberate snap that communicated exactly how much of his attention the warning had received. I've never stopped looking at anything. Harmon looked at him for a long moment. No, he said finally. I don't suppose you have. He stood, collected his coffee cup, and moved toward the door. He paused once, hand on the frame, and said without turning around, "Bumpy Johnson is sitting in a prison cell right now. Marlo, he can't touch you, can't watch you, can't know you exist. By the time he gets out, you'll have a case built so tight there's nowhere for him to go, except back inside. That's the theory." Another pause, longer this time. "Just make sure you understand the difference between a theory and a guarantee before you spend 6 years of your life on one." Then he was gone, and Marlo was alone with the thick folder and the photograph of the man with the quiet eyes. And he felt something he had not felt in years, the clean, electric excitement of a problem genuinely worthy of his ability. He opened the folder again and began to read. What followed were 6 years that Marlo would later describe, in the relatively few conversations he had about that period, as the most consuming work of his professional life. He built his case against Bumpy Johnson the way a watchmaker builds a complicated mechanism piece by piece, with exacting patience, with the understanding that each component had to fit perfectly before the next one could be added. He interviewed 43 individuals with direct knowledge of Johnson's operation, most of them more than once, cross-referencing their accounts with financial records, telephone logs, and physical surveillance reports until the inconsistencies that always existed between independent testimonies had been accounted for and resolved. He cailed informants into Harlem's network with the careful, methodical approach of a man who understood that the value of a source was directly proportional to how deeply embedded they could become before anyone noticed them. He tracked financial flows through layers of legitimate business, a dry cleaning operation on 125th Street, a real estate holding company with an address in the Bronx, a small import firm whose paperwork was immaculate and whose actual business Marlo had spent 4 months establishing to his own satisfaction. The file grew. 412 pages by the time Johnson's release date approached. 412 pages of surveillance photographs, financial analysis, witness statements, organizational charts, telephone intercepts, and the kind of careful step-by-step evidentiary construction that Marlo believed, genuinely, deeply, with the confidence of a man who had done this many times before and never been wrong, was airtight. He knew Bumpy Johnson's case the way he knew his own reflection. He knew that Johnson took his coffee black without sugar, knew the titles of the philosophy books that arrived at Alcatraz addressed to Cell Block B, knew the names of every person Johnson had corresponded with during his incarceration. He knew the routes Johnson's associates used for their collections, the banks they favored, the attorneys they retained. He knew everything, and knowing everything, he believed, was the same as having power over the thing you knew. This belief, this assumption so fundamental that Marlo had never once examined it, was the first and most important mistake of his professional life. He would not understand this until much later. He would not understand it. In fact, until the morning that a white-haired man sat in a cold car on West 26th Street and repeated the same sentence over and over into the empty air. November 1963 arrived with the particular gray chill that descends on New York in the weeks before winter fully commits itself. And on the morning of Johnson's release, Marlo positioned himself in the terminal at Idlewild Airport with the practiced invisibility of a man who had spent years watching without being seen. He had chosen his position carefully, a vantage point near the arrivals gate that offered clear sight lines while keeping him in the natural flow of foot traffic, indistinguishable from the dozens of people moving through that space at any given moment. He had been there for 40 minutes before the right figure appeared. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, walked through the arrivals gate at 10 minutes past 9 in the morning of November 28, 1963. And what struck Marlo first, what lodged itself in his memory, with the insistent clarity of a detail that refuses to be filed away as ordinary, was not what he had expected to feel when he finally saw this man in person, after 6 years of inhabiting his world through documentation and analysis. He had expected to feel the hunter's recognition of prey. He had expected the particular satisfaction of a long wait reaching its conclusion. What he felt instead was something more complicated and less comfortable. Something he did not immediately have language for and would spend considerable time afterward trying to articulate to himself. Johnson was 57 years old, and he looked precisely that age, the hair at his temples silver white, the lines of his face carrying the settled depth that comes not from hardship alone, but from a long and careful education in the nature of things. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him with the quiet precision of good tailoring, and he walked through that terminal the way a man walks through a space he has already assessed and found non-threatening, not quickly, not with the scanning alertness of someone concerned about his environment, but with a measured, unhurried stride that suggested complete comfort in his own presence. He was not looking around. He was not checking exits or watching faces. He was simply moving, with the calm of a man who has not needed to be afraid of a room in a very long time. Marlo watched him cross the terminal floor and thought, with a certainty that surprised him slightly, the prey has come home. Now it begins. He noted the time in his small leather notebook, noted Johnson's physical appearance and apparent condition, noted the two individuals who met Johnson at the edge of the terminal and walked out with him. He had everything he needed. He returned to his office, updated his file, and spent the afternoon in the comfortable productivity of a man whose plan is proceeding exactly as designed. He did not think about the fact that Johnson had not looked around. He did not think about what it meant that a man just released from 10 years of federal imprisonment walked through a crowded public terminal without once scanning the faces around him for the face of someone watching. He did not think about this because the explanation seemed obvious. Johnson was simply confident, simply relieved. Simply a man who had done his time and was walking free and had no particular reason to worry about being observed. This explanation was reasonable and available, and Marlo accepted it immediately. The way we all accept the explanations that cost us nothing. 3 weeks later, on the morning of December 19th, 1963, Marlo arrived at his desk in the federal field office to find an envelope sitting in the center of his blotter. It had not come through the mail system. There was no postmark, no routing stamp, no indication of how it had arrived. It had simply appeared, as though it had always been there, as though the desk had grown it overnight like a peculiar paper flower. His name was written on the front in a careful, even hand. He opened it. Inside was a single photograph, black and white. The quality slightly grainy in the way of photographs taken from a distance with a long lens. It showed the interior of an airport terminal, the arrivals area at Idlewild, on the morning of November 28, 1963. The photograph was taken from somewhere behind and to the left of the subject, capturing a man in a dark coat standing near the terminal wall, a small leather notebook held open in his left hand, his right hand holding a pen. The man's face was not visible, but the cut of the coat was unmistakable, the posture unmistakable, the notebook unmistakable. It was Marlo, standing exactly where he had stood, watching exactly who he had been watching, on the morning he had believed himself to be completely invisible. Beneath the photograph, on a separate sheet of white paper folded once, was a single line of handwriting. The penmanship was precise and unhurried. The letters formed with the careful attention of a man who had spent a long time in confined spaces reading and writing and thinking. And it said, "Welcome back, Detective Marlo. I have been expecting you for quite some time." Below the line, in the same hand, 2 words, Bumpy Johnson. Marlo sat at his desk for a long time without moving. The office moved around him. Phones rang. Colleagues passed. The ordinary machinery of the working day continued its indifferent operation. He sat and looked at the photograph and the note and felt the first cold displacement of a certainty beginning to give way. The way solid ground feels when water is moving beneath it. He had spent 6 years building a case against this man. 6 years of surveillance and analysis and source cultivation. 6 years of believing that the accumulation of knowledge constituted the accumulation of control. And this man who had been sitting in a federal prison cell on an island in San Francisco Bay for the majority of those 6 years had been watching him back. Not from a distance, not through intermediaries, from 15 feet away, in a crowded airport terminal. Close enough that whoever had taken this photograph could have reached out and touched Marlo's shoulder. Close enough that Johnson himself, or someone acting on Johnson's specific instructions, had been standing within the same small portion of air that Marlo had occupied while believing himself invisible, and had documented the fact with the patient, almost affectionate precision of a man making a record of something he finds gently amusing. Marlo had known everything about Bumpy Johnson. He had known the books and the coffee and the correspondences and the financial flows. He had known the associates and the routes and the holding companies. He had spent 6 years filling 412 pages with the texture of another man's existence. And he had called that knowledge power. And he had believed that belief completely. What the photograph told him, what the neat, unhurried handwriting confirmed, was that while he had been building a file 412 pages thick, Bumpy Johnson had been building something too. Something Marlo could not yet see the edges of. Something that had apparently been in operation long enough and with sufficient reach that on the first day of Johnson's freedom, when Marlo had believed himself to be the invisible observer, a camera had already been pointed at him. He had not been watching Bumpy Johnson walk through that terminal. He understood this now, with the clammy, disorienting clarity of a man who has just realized the ground he is standing on is not the ground he thought it was. He had been walking into a frame, and Bumpy Johnson, 63 miles above the Pacific Ocean, in a federal prison cell at Alcatraz, or later in the careful weeks of preparation before his release, had already known where the frame would be. Marlo was not hunting Bumpy Johnson. He was beginning to understand, in the wordless, physical way that the body understands things before the mind can name them, that the question worth asking was not whether he could catch this man. The question, the only question that now mattered, the one that would keep him awake through the long months ahead, was simpler and far more unsettling. At what precise moment had Bumpy Johnson begun hunting him back? The photograph sat on the corner of Marlo's desk for 3 days before he moved it. And during those 3 days he returned to it repeatedly, in the way a man returns to a wound he cannot stop touching. Not because it brings relief, but because the pain of it confirms that something real has happened. Then, on the 4th morning, he turned it face down, opened a fresh legal pad, and began to think with the cold, systematic clarity that had made him the best investigative mind in the field office. The shock had done its work. Now it was time to respond. What Marlo understood, sitting at his desk in the gray December light, was that he had been operating on a fundamental assumption that the photograph had just destroyed, which was that surveillance was a one-directional activity, that the observer and the observed occupied fixed positions that did not shift. He understood now that this assumption had been wrong, and that it had been wrong from the beginning, and that Johnson had known it was wrong while Marlo had not. This meant that the 6-year case Marlo had built, the 412 pages in the thick folder, was compromised to a degree he could not yet measure. He did not know how deeply Johnson's awareness of the investigation extended. He did not know what Johnson knew and what he merely suspected. What he knew was that he needed new sources, sources that Johnson had not had time to identify, and he needed them operating in Harlem before Johnson had established the full architecture of whatever it was he was building in the months since his release. Within 3 weeks of receiving the photograph, Marlo had placed 3 informants into Harlem's network, with a level of operational care that exceeded anything he had previously attempted. Tommy Reeves was a 26-year-old from the Bronx with a gambling debt that the federal government had quietly agreed to make manageable in exchange for his cooperation, a young man who moved easily in the social spaces around Harlem's numbers operation, and who had 2 genuine friendships with people in Johnson's orbit. Carl Dunbar was older, 31, a former driver for one of Johnson's associates who had been arrested on an unrelated charge and had agreed, with evident reluctance, to provide information in exchange for a reduced sentence. Louis Webb was the most carefully constructed of the 3, a man with no prior criminal record, no existing connection to the investigation, inserted into Harlem's community through a series of introductions so natural and so gradually developed that Marlo was confident no retrospective analysis could identify them as engineered. All 3 were briefed separately, handled separately, and kept entirely ignorant of each other's existence. Marlo had structured the network so that no single point of compromise could unravel the whole. He believed, meticulous. Surveillance on Johnson ran 24 hours a day through rotating teams that Marlo personally supervised, changing personnel on a schedule designed to prevent any single watcher from becoming a recognizable fixture in Johnson's environment. He mapped Johnson's movements with the patient precision of a cartographer, building a complete picture of the geography of the man's daily existence, the streets he favored, the establishments he visited, the routes between them, the people who appeared in his proximity with enough regularity to constitute a pattern. What that map showed, accumulated over weeks and then months of meticulous observation, was something that Marlo found increasingly difficult to interpret without unsettling conclusions. Bumpy Johnson's daily life, as recorded by federal surveillance teams operating at the highest level of the field office's capability, was almost aggressively ordinary. Every morning, without exception, Johnson arrived at a small coffee shop on 116th Street between a barber shop and a tailor, sat at the same corner table, and drank 2 cups of black coffee over the course of approximately an hour while reading a newspaper or, occasionally, a book. The books, which surveillance photographs allowed Marlo to identify, were Philosophy, Marcus Aurelius, Montaigne, a worn copy of Spinoza's Ethics that appeared repeatedly over several weeks. In the afternoons, Johnson played chess with an elderly man named Franklin Greer at a community center on Lenox Avenue. Games that reportedly lasted 2 hours and that Johnson won with consistent but unhurried regularity. In the evenings, he read, received occasional visitors at his apartment, and retired at a reasonable hour. There were no large transactions that surveillance could document, no meetings in locations that suggested criminal purpose, no exchanges that looked like anything other than the ordinary social interactions of a man living quietly in his own neighborhood. The operation Marlo had expected to materialize the reassertion of Johnson's control over Harlem's criminal infrastructure, the resumption of the networks that had kept running in his absence. The power consolidation that any returning boss would need to undertake simply did not appear. Not in the surveillance photographs, not in the informant reports, not anywhere in the accumulating record of a man who appeared to be doing nothing more remarkable than drinking coffee and playing chess and reading Spinoza. Marlo's colleagues, who had never shared his conviction about the case, began to say things in the corridors and around the coffee machine that he was required to ignore in the interests of his own focus. Gerald Harmon had retired by then, replaced by a supervisor named Caulfield, who had the efficient lack of sentiment of a man primarily interested in case clearance rates. And Caulfield had twice in the past month asked Marlo in the measured language of institutional patience whether continued heavy resource allocation on Johnson was the most productive use of the field office's capacity. 2 agents who had been assigned to rotating surveillance had separately and informally told mutual colleagues that the Bumpy Johnson operation felt like watching a retired school teacher go about his day. One of them had used the phrase "harmless old man" in a conversation that Marlo had not been meant to hear. But had. Marlo heard all of this and filed it away and continued his surveillance and continued his case, and told himself that the absence of visible activity was itself a form of activity, that Johnson was simply being careful, was simply taking his time, was simply waiting for the right moment to move. He told himself that the patience he had admired in Johnson's history was now being employed against him, and that the correct response to patience was more patience. He told himself these things with the conviction of a man who needs his convictions to hold, because the alternative, that he might be wrong, was not something he could afford to consider. It was in the second week of April 1964 that Tommy Reeves called the contact number, with the particular urgency in his voice that Marlo had trained him to reserve for significant developments. And what Reeves reported when they met in the back booth of a diner in Queens that same evening was the kind of intelligence that makes an investigator's hands go still with the weight of what they are holding. Johnson was planning a major operation, Reeves said, a consolidation of financial control involving several Harlem businesses that would give Johnson effective ownership of a significant portion of the neighborhood's legitimate economy as cover for a reorganized criminal network. The meeting where the final arrangements would be made was scheduled for the night of April 19th at a warehouse on the west side of Manhattan near the Hudson River, an address Reeves provided with the specific, confident detail of a man who had been present when the location was discussed. Marlo sat with this information for less than 48 hours before he made the decision that his entire career had been building toward. On the night of April 19th, 1964 at 9 o'clock in the evening, Vincent Marlo led 12 federal agents through the side entrance of a warehouse on the west side of Manhattan and into the confirmation of everything he had feared since December and refused to believe. The warehouse was empty of people. Not recently vacated, not a space where people had been present minutes ago and left in haste, taking their evidence with them. It was empty in the way of a space that had been arranged specifically and deliberately to be found in exactly this condition, by exactly these people at exactly this time. A single wooden table occupied the center of the warehouse floor, positioned with geometric precision beneath the building's one functioning overhead light. On the table sat a coffee pot, its glass carafe still holding coffee that was, when Marlo pressed his palm against the side of it, warm. 3 ceramic cups were arranged beside the pot. 3 chairs sat around the table, one on each of 3 sides, the 4th side open, facing the entrance through which Marlo and his 12 agents had just walked. On the table, arranged in a neat row beside the coffee pot with the orderly care of documents prepared for a formal meeting, were 3 manila folders. Each folder had a photograph, paper clipped to its cover. Tommy Reeves looked up from the first folder with his official bureau identification photograph. Carl Dunbar looked up from the second. Lewis Webb looked up from the third. Marlo stood over the table and opened the first folder with hands that he would not allow to be unsteady. And what he found inside was a complete record of Tommy Reeves's activities as a federal informant, not a summary, not a partial account, but a comprehensive chronological documentation of every meeting, every report, every piece of information Reeves had provided, annotated in some places with corrections noting where the information had been inaccurate and what the accurate version was. The second and third folders were identical in structure and equivalent in completeness for Dunbar and Webb, respectively. Together, the 3 folders represented a more thorough operational record of Marlo's informant network than the files Marlo himself maintained. Because Marlo's files contained what his informants had told him, while these folders contained what his informants had told him and what the truth actually was. He stood at that table for a long time. His 12 agents moved through the warehouse with the professional thoroughness of men executing a procedure, checking every corner and entrance point and documenting the absence of anything worth documenting. The coffee in the pot stayed warm. The 3 folders stayed open on the table. The 3 empty chairs waited with the patient neutrality of objects that have already done what they were placed here to do. Johnson had not simply known about the informants. He had known about them, allowed them to operate, monitored what they reported, corrected their inaccuracies in his own documentation, and then used Tommy Reeves specifically, the one Marlo had trusted most and cultivated longest, to deliver Marlo and his 12 agents to an empty room with 3 chairs and a warm pot of coffee at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The informants had not been compromised by a leak in the field office. There had been no betrayal from inside. Johnson had simply watched them, understood them, and turned them into instruments of his own purposes, while they believed they were instruments of Marlo's. The psychological collapse that followed was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It moved through Marlo in the following days the way cold moves through a building whose heating has failed gradually, pervasively, touching everything. He began to review his case with the systematic suspicion of a man who no longer trusts his own work. And what this review produced was not reassurance. He pulled at threads and found them looser than they had appeared. He re-examined witness statements and heard in their language the faint, retrospective echo of responses that had been shaped by someone who understood what Marlo needed to hear. He looked at his financial analysis and began to see the architecture not of Johnson's criminal operation, but of a carefully constructed performance of a criminal operation, designed to be found by investigators looking for exactly the things Marlo had been trained to look for. He questioned his colleagues with a directness that damaged several professional relationships, demanding to know who had access to informant files, who had discussed the case in unsecured locations, who had potentially and inadvertently disclosed operational details. His colleagues responded with the defensive irritation of people being accused of a failure they had not committed, and the investigations he demanded produced nothing because there was nothing to find, which left him in the worst position of having to accept the alternative that no one had failed, that no one had betrayed him, that Bumpy Johnson had simply been smarter than the entire structure arrayed against him, and had been smarter quietly, invisibly, without leaving evidence of the intelligence that had defeated Marlo at every point of contact. It was this conclusion, or the approaching proximity of it, that drove Marlo to do the thing he had been trained never to do, which was abandon the structure of his investigation and make direct personal contact with his subject. On the morning of April 28th, 9 days after the warehouse, Marlo walked into the coffee shop on 116th Street at 7 minutes past 8, crossed the floor to the corner table where Bumpy Johnson was sitting with his newspaper and his coffee, pulled out the chair opposite, and sat down without being invited. Johnson looked up from his newspaper. He regarded Marlo with an expression of mild, courteous interest, the way a man looks at someone who has done something slightly unexpected but not particularly alarming. He did not seem surprised. He did not seem concerned. He folded his newspaper with the unhurried precision of a man who has all the time available to him that he could possibly require, set it beside his cup, and waited. Marlo placed a folder on the table between them, not the 412-page case file that was gone now, in every meaningful sense. A smaller, newer file, containing what he had been able to preserve and reconstruct after the warehouse. "I have enough to send you back," Marlo said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. "Enough to build a case that will hold, Mr. Johnson. Enough to end this." Johnson looked at the folder without touching it. Then he looked at Marlo, and what Marlo saw in his eyes was not contempt and not hostility and not the guarded watchfulness of a man who has been cornered. It was something closer to the expression of a chess player watching an opponent make a move that the player had anticipated several turns ago and has already accounted for in his response. Johnson picked up his coffee cup, took a slow, considered sip, and set it down with the quiet of a man for whom there is no urgency in the world. "You have enough," Johnson said, in a voice that carried the even, unhurried quality of someone speaking a simple truth to someone who has not yet understood it. "To believe you have enough." He paused, not for effect, but in the way of a man choosing his words with the genuine care of someone who means what he says precisely. Those are two entirely different things. Detective, I'd have thought 6 years of your time would have taught you to tell them apart. Marlo left the coffee shop without responding, because there was nothing to say that would not confirm, in one way or another, that Johnson was right. He returned to the field office and sat at his desk and began, for the first time, to seriously consider the possibility that this case was no longer recoverable. It was in this state depleted, doubting, the 6-year architecture of his professional certainty visibly weakened at every load-bearing point that the final collapse arrived. It arrived not in a single moment, but across 48 hours that began on the morning of May 5, 1964, and that Marlo would later be unable to fully reconstruct because the pieces came so fast and from so many directions simultaneously that keeping track of the sequence became impossible. The first call came at 8:30, when the assistant district attorney overseeing the parallel prosecution file informed Marlo that the case's most important witness, a man named Gerald Portis, who had agreed 18 months earlier to testify about financial transactions he had personally facilitated, had filed a sworn affidavit the previous afternoon stating that his original statement had been obtained under coercive interrogation conditions. The affidavit was accompanied by an audio recording, a recording whose origin no one could immediately establish, that contained what appeared to be a federal agent using language toward Portis that was, at minimum, deeply problematic and, at maximum, legally fatal to every statement Portis had ever provided. Before Marlo had finished processing this, the second call arrived. The financial records at the center of his evidentiary case had been flagged by the office's own legal review team as having been obtained through a procedural process that contained a defect significant enough to render them inadmissible. The defect was technical, the kind of detail that existed in the fine structure of evidentiary law. But it was real, and it was documented, and it had been identified through a formal complaint submitted to the legal review office by an attorney whose identity the review team was not immediately able to confirm. And then, on the morning of May 6th, a journalist at the New York Tribune received an anonymous package containing the full names, addresses, operational histories, and bureau identification numbers of Tommy Reeves, Carl Dunbar, and Lewis Webb. The package contained no letter, no explanation, no indication of its origin. It contained only the documentation, presented with the clean, organized clarity of a file prepared by someone who understood precisely what the information meant and precisely what publishing it would accomplish. The Tribune ran the story. By the evening of May 6th, Vincent Marlo had been suspended from active duty pending an internal investigation into the conduct of his case. The investigation would find, over the following weeks, that the audio recording of the Portis interrogation was genuine, that the procedural defect in the financial records was genuine, and that the exposure of the informants, while clearly orchestrated, could not be traced to any identifiable source. No one at the field office had leaked. No one in the prosecution structure had sabotaged the case. The recording, the defect, the anonymous package each arrived from a direction that yielded, upon examination, nothing but dead ends and open questions. Marlo sat in his apartment the night of his suspension and understood, with the total and irreversible clarity that comes only when there is nothing left to defend against it, what had happened to him. His case had not been destroyed by violence or by threat. It had been dismantled with the same patient, architectural precision that he had spent 6 years applying to its construction, piece by piece, each piece removed at exactly the right moment in exactly the right sequence, The entire structure brought down by a man who had apparently spent at least as much time understanding Marlo's case as Marlo had spent building it, and who had done so without leaving a single fingerprint on a single page of a single document that Marlo could now hold up and say this. This is where Bumpy Johnson touched my work. He could not prove Johnson had done any of it. That was the thing that would keep him awake in the weeks and months ahead. The thing that would sit behind his eyes in the parking structure on West 26th Street when the patrol officer found him. Everything had happened. Everything had been destroyed. And there was not one piece of evidence, not one traceable action, not one witness who could place Bumpy Johnson at the center of any of it. It had all simply occurred. The way weather occurs, consequential, undeniable, and impossible to hold responsible. Marlo had lost everything in 48 hours, not to a man who was stronger than him, or faster, or more ruthless, or more willing to use force. He had lost everything to a man who had simply understood, from the very beginning, and with a completeness that Marlo was only now fully appreciating, that the most durable kind of power is the kind that leaves no evidence of itself, the kind that moves through the world like a current beneath still water, shaping everything above the surface without ever breaking it. The question that would haunt every hour of what remained of Vincent Marlo's career was not how Bumpy Johnson had done it. The question was simpler and more devastating than that. The question was whether any of it, the 6 years, the 412 pages, the 3 informants, the 12 agents in an empty warehouse, the folder on the coffee shop table, whether any of it had ever been a genuine investigation, or whether it had always, from the very first moment that Marlo had picked up that thick folder in the smoke-smelling conference room in 1955 and snapped it shut with quiet, confident finality, been exactly what Bumpy Johnson needed it to be. The internal investigation into Vincent Marlo's conduct lasted 11 weeks and concluded, in the careful language of institutional self-examination, that no deliberate misconduct had been identified, but that significant procedural failures had compromised the integrity of a multi-year federal investigation at considerable cost to the office's resources and credibility. The report recommended remedial review of informant handling protocols and evidence collection procedures. It did not recommend criminal referral. It did not recommend termination. It produced, in the end, the particular kind of verdict that bureaucracies produce when they need to acknowledge that something went seriously wrong without assigning the wrongness to any person in particular, a verdict of systemic failure, which is the institutional equivalent of saying that the building burned down, but the fire started itself. Marlo returned to the field office after his suspension was lifted and sat at his desk and did his work. And his colleagues treated him with the careful, slightly avoidant courtesy that people extend to someone who has experienced a visible and public diminishment. Nobody mentioned Johnson. Nobody mentioned the warehouse or the folders or the 48 hours in May that had taken 6 years of work apart. The case file on Ellsworth Johnson was reassigned, nominally, to a junior agent who reviewed it briefly, found it too compromised to rebuild, and quietly moved it to inactive status. The 412 pages sat in a filing cabinet in the basement archive and gathered the particular kind of dust that settles on work that no one intends to return to. For 3 weeks in June of 1964, Marlo came to the office every morning, signed in, sat at his desk, and performed the visible motions of a working federal agent. He attended briefings and contributed nothing to them. He reviewed files that did not require reviewing. He drank the office coffee, which had always been bad, and did not appear to notice that it was bad, which was itself a form of evidence about where his attention actually resided. His colleagues, watching him with the peripheral awareness of people who have learned not to look directly at something uncomfortable, noted privately that he seemed to be moving through the office the way a man moves through a place he is no longer certain is real, carefully, quietly, with the considered attention of someone testing each step before committing his full weight to it. On the morning of June 17th, 1964. Vincent Marlo arrived at the field office at his usual time, signed in at the front desk, and walked to his office. A colleague who occupied the adjacent office later told investigators that Marlo sat down at his desk, folded his hands on the surface in front of him, and looked at the wall. Not at anything on the wall held a calendar, a map of the 5 boroughs with various pins and markings, a photograph of Marlo receiving a commendation 3 years earlier from a director who had since himself retired. He looked at the wall the way a man looks at something he is no longer seeing. The gaze turned inward rather than outward, focused on whatever interior landscape had become more present to him than the room he was physically occupying. The colleague, not wishing to intrude on what appeared to be private thought, said nothing. An hour passed, then another. At some point shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning, Marlo stood up from his desk, straightened his jacket with the habitual gesture of a man who has always been careful about his appearance, and walked out of the office. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He did not collect the personal items from his desk, the photograph, the coffee mug with a chip in the handle that had been there for 2 years, the small leather notebook he had carried every day of his professional life. He walked out of the building and into the ordinary New York morning and did not come back. His resignation arrived by post 4 days later, a single typed page, formally worded, citing personal reasons, containing nothing that explained anything. The field office processed it with the efficient impersonality of an institution that has seen many departures and treats each one as primarily an administrative event. His case files were redistributed. His desk was cleaned out and reassigned. His name remained in the personnel records and gradually stopped appearing in conversations, the way names do when there is nothing remaining to attach them to. What became of Vincent Marlo after that morning in June is a question that yields, depending on who is asked and when, a variety of answers, none of which can be fully verified. There are accounts of a man matching his description living quietly in a small town in upstate New York, working in a hardware store, speaking to no one about his previous life. There is a record of someone with his name and approximate age enrolling in a philosophy course at a community college in New Jersey in the fall of 1965, attending for 1 semester, and then not returning. There are people who claim to have encountered him in various unremarkable places in the years that followed, and who report, consistently, the same detail: that he seemed well enough, seemed calm, seemed to have arrived at some private accommodation with whatever had happened to him, but that there was something behind his eyes, something settled and permanent, that had not been there before, something that looked like understanding, the particular kind of understanding that is indistinguishable from the outside, from a wound that is healed in an unusual shape. Nobody in Harlem asked what had happened to the federal agent who had spent 6 years trying to bring Bumpy Johnson down. Harlem had seen many such men come and go across the decades, men with badges and files, and the absolute conviction of people who believe that sufficient institutional authority, applied with sufficient determination, can reach into any corner of any world and extract what it is looking for. Harlem had watched those men work, and had watched them leave, and had learned what people learn who have watched this pattern repeat often enough, which is that the lesson's never really about the individual man. The lesson is about the nature of the kind of intelligence that cannot be measured in files, or captured in surveillance photographs, or recruited as an informant, because it exists not in any specific action or transaction, but in a quality of understanding of people, of systems, of the way that the mechanisms others build to trap you can be studied and learned, and ultimately returned to sender. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson lived in Harlem for 4 more years after Vincent Marlo walked out of the federal field office and did not return. He drank his coffee every morning at the corner table. He played chess with Franklin Greer on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. He read his philosophy, the Marcus Aurelius, the Montaigne, the Spinoza that surveillance photographs had documented so carefully for so long. He died on the evening of July 7th, 1968 of a heart attack. At 62 years old, in a restaurant in Harlem, in the company of people who knew him. He was never charged with any crime after his release from Alcatraz in 1963. The federal government, in the years between his release and his death, opened no successful case against him. The file that had once been 412 pages sat in a basement archive and continued to gather dust, and no one went back to it, and no one was ever able to demonstrate, through any legal or evidentiary process, that Bumpy Johnson had done anything in those final 5 years of his life, except drink coffee and play chess and read books about how to think clearly in a complicated world. In Harlem, the story of what happened to the federal agent who had spent 6 years trying to bring Johnson down became one of those stories that circulates in the particular way of stories about which the full truth cannot be safely spoken aloud, passed in pieces, in implication, in the kind of language that communicates everything to someone who already understands and nothing to someone who does not. The story was not about violence. It was not about threat or force or any of the instruments that people typically associate with the power Bumpy Johnson was understood to possess. It was about something quieter and, in its own way, more absolute. It was about what happens when a man spends years learning everything about another man and fails to understand that the other man has been learning everything about him. The question of what Marlo saw, what understanding arrived in the parking structure on West 26th Street with sufficient force to turn a 34-year-old man's hair white overnight, is one that no one who knew him ever asked directly, and that he himself, in whatever conversations he had and whatever life he built after June of 1964, apparently never answered. Perhaps the answer was simply the full weight of what the photograph and the warehouse and the coffee shop and the 48 hours in May had been accumulating toward, arriving all at once in the particular vulnerable hours of a sleepless night, the understanding that he had never been the hunter, that the clean, electric excitement he had felt in that conference room in 1955 when he picked up the folder and felt the righteous momentum of a superior mind taking on a worthy problem, that feeling had been accurate. But the roles had been reversed from the very beginning in ways he could not have seen and would spend years learning to accept. There is a version of this story that ends with a moral, a lesson extracted and presented with the clean finality of a conclusion that resolves everything that preceded it. But the more honest version ends where it actually ends, which is with an old man drinking coffee at a corner table in Harlem on an ordinary morning, reading a philosophy book, unhurried, undisturbed, the neighborhood moving around him with the comfortable familiarity of a place that has always known exactly who he was, and with a question that hangs in the air above everything, unanswered and unanswerable. What does it take to become the kind of person who cannot be hunted? Not the kind of person who is strong enough to defeat the people who come for them. The kind of person who understands those people so completely, their methods, their assumptions, their certainties, the particular blindnesses that their competence creates in them, that the hunt itself becomes, in their hands, a different kind of instrument entirely. The most dangerous person in any room is rarely the loudest, rarely the largest, rarely the most visibly formidable. The most dangerous person in any room is the one who has already finished reading every other person in it, including, and most especially, the ones who walked in believing they were there to read him. That was Bumpy Johnson. That was what 6 years of federal investigation, 412 pages of meticulous documentation, 3 informants, 12 agents, and 1 very good detective ultimately produced not a conviction, not a case, not a single provable thing, but the most complete possible demonstration of a principle that Harlem had always understood, and that Vincent Marlo learned too late and too finely to make any use of. Power that leaves no fingerprints is the only power that truly lasts, and the man who knows you better than you know yourself has already won every contest between you. including the ones that have not yet begun.